On a quiet spring morning, April 12th, 2022, at 7:45 a.m., Grace found herself in the grip of a nightmare she never anticipated. The stillness of her home in Pine Valley, Massachusetts, was shattered by the sight of her mother, Elaine, lying motionless on the living room floor. Grace's heart pounded as she dropped to her knees beside her, desperately searching for signs of life. But Elaine's body was cold, her skin pale, and her eyes lifeless. The room, once filled with warmth and love, now felt empty and haunting. Grace's world crumbled at that moment. Her mother was her anchor, the only family she had left after her father's death years earlier. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her mother's hand, unable to comprehend the sudden loss. But amidst the overwhelming grief, a chilling realization began to take root. Standing in the doorway, silently watching the scene unfold, was Paul, her stepfather. His face was expressionless, his eyes distant, as if he were merely observing a routine occurrence. Paul had always been a man of few words, keeping a cold distance from both Grace and Elaine. He married Elaine 2 years ago, shortly after meeting her at a corporate event. To Grace, he was a stranger who had entered their lives and never truly became part of it. Now, in the face of this tragedy, his silence felt ominous, a stark contrast to the anguish consuming Grace. As the minutes ticked by, Grace noticed something unsettling about Paul's demeanor. He didn't rush to call for help, didn't kneel beside his wife's body, didn't even shed a tear. Instead, he calmly walked over to the kitchen as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The tension in the room was suffocating. Grace, still in shock, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The way Paul seemed almost detached from the horror before he planted the first seeds of doubt in her mind. Grace was a 23-year-old woman with a gentle soul. She grew up in Pine Valley, a small town where everyone knew each other. Raised by her mother, Elaine, after her father passed away when she was just 7, Grace formed a bond with her mother that was unbreakable. Elaine was not only her mother, but also her best friend, guiding Grace through every stage of life with warmth and understanding. Grace was sensitive, often wearing her heart on her sleeve, and she trusted easily, perhaps too easily. Growing up, Grace had always been a quiet, introspective child. She loved books, art, and spending time in the garden with Elaine. She was the kind of person who saw the good in everyone, even when others didn't. This made her well-liked, but also vulnerable to those who didn't have her best interests at heart. Her emotional depth allowed her to connect deeply with others, but it also meant she felt pain and loss more acutely. When Paul entered their lives, Grace hoped he would bring some joy to her mother, but she could never shake the feeling that something about him was off. Paul was a stark contrast to Elaine and Grace. He was a successful businessman in his mid-50s, well-dressed and always composed, but beneath his polished exterior was a man who kept his emotions tightly controlled, often coming across as cold and unapproachable. He never showed much interest in getting to know Grace, treating her more like an obligation than family. His relationship with Elaine seemed formal, lacking the warmth and affection that Grace was used to seeing between couples. He was meticulous, always in control, never raising his voice, yet there was something unsettling about his calm demeanor. Over time, subtle signs began to emerge that hinted at Paul's darker nature. He would make offhand comments that undermined Elaine's confidence, always in a way that seemed innocuous but left a lasting sting. He had a habit of disappearing for hours without explanation, his whereabouts a mystery even to Elaine. There were whispers around town about his previous marriages, all of which ended abruptly, with little explanation from Paul himself. His past was a closed book, and whenever Grace or Elaine tried to ask about it, Paul would deflect the conversation or give vague, unsatisfying answers. Grace's life changed drastically after her mother's death. The warmth of her home turned cold, mirroring Paul's demeanor. She felt isolated, trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. Paul's behavior grew more controlling. He insisted on managing the household finances and began subtly questioning Grace's decisions, making her doubt herself. The once vibrant and joyful Grace became withdrawn, her grief compounded by the growing tension between her and Paul. The man who had been a distant figure in her life was now at the center of it, and every day she felt the walls closing in a little more. In the weeks following Elaine's death, Grace's grief became all-consuming. On the surface, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but inside, she was unraveling. Each day felt like an endless loop of sorrow and confusion. On April 20th, just 8 days after losing her mother, Grace experienced the first of what would become many unsettling visions. It was late at night, around 11:30 p.m. when Grace first saw her mother. She was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television that was turned off, when she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning her head, she saw Elaine standing in the doorway, just as she had been the morning Grace found her. But this time, Elaine's expression was different. Her face was twisted in worry, her eyes full of fear. Grace gasped, blinking rapidly, and in that instant, Elaine was gone. Grace sat frozen, her heart racing. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a manifestation of her grief. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. The visions continued, each one more vivid than the last. On April 26th, at exactly 2:15 a.m., Grace woke up to the sound of whispering. The house was dark and silent, but she could clearly hear her mother's voice calling her name. She followed the voice down the hallway, her hands trembling as she reached the living room. There, in the dim light, she saw Elaine again, this time pointing toward Paul's study. The message was clear, though unspoken. Something was hidden there, something Grace needed to find. But before she could take another step, Paul's bedroom door creaked open. Grace turned, and the vision vanished, leaving her alone in the darkened hallway. Paul's presence in the house grew more oppressive by the day. He began monitoring Grace's movements, questioning her whenever she left the house, and insisting on knowing who she was meeting. When Grace tried to talk to him about her mother, he dismissed her concerns with a cold, calculating calmness. "You need to move on, Grace. Dwelling on the past won't bring your mother back," he would say, his voice devoid of any warmth or empathy. But it wasn't just his words that unnerved Grace. It was the way he looked at her as if he knew something she didn't, as if he was waiting for her to break. As the visions became more frequent, Grace confided in a close friend, Emily, about what she was experiencing. "Emily, I keep seeing my mom," she whispered over the phone one evening. "She's trying to tell me something. Warn me about Paul, I think." Emily, concerned but cautious, suggested Grace see a therapist. But when Grace mentioned the idea to Paul, his reaction was swift and unsettling. "Therapy? For what?" Paul asked, his tone sharp. "You're just upset, Grace. It's natural to feel lost after losing your mother, but these visions, they're not real. You need to get a grip." The way he said it, with such finality, made Grace doubt herself. She began to wonder if she was indeed losing her mind. Paul even took it a step further, contacting a family doctor who was quick to agree that Grace's visions were likely the result of stress and grief. Without Grace's consent, Paul scheduled an appointment for her, framing it as a necessary step toward her recovery. In the following days, Paul started to isolate Grace further. He made subtle changes around the house, removing items that belonged to Elaine, redecorating rooms that held memories of her mother, and insisting on selling Grace's car, leaving her more dependent on him for transportation. When Grace protested, Paul's response was always the same. "You need a fresh start. Holding on to these things isn't healthy." Grace's attempts to reach out to others were thwarted by Paul's interference. On May 3rd, Grace visited Dr. Alan Thompson, the therapist Emily had recommended. But during the session, Grace couldn't focus. She was plagued by the fear that Paul might have already poisoned the therapist's opinion of her. Her suspicions were confirmed when Dr. Thompson suggested that Paul join their next session to facilitate better communication. Grace's heart sank. She felt trapped, unable to trust anyone around her. The tension between Grace and Paul reached a breaking point on May 10th. That evening, Grace was in the kitchen making tea when she felt the familiar chill that accompanied her mother's presence. Turning slowly, she saw Elaine standing by the window, her finger pressed to her lips, signaling for Grace to be quiet. Grace's eyes filled with tears as Elaine gestured toward a drawer near Paul's desk in the study. This time, Grace was determined to follow through. After Paul went to bed, Grace crept into his study. The house was silent except for the sound of her own breathing. She opened the drawer Elaine had pointed to, her hands shaking. Inside, she found a small, locked box. Desperate, Grace searched the room for the key, finally locating it in a hidden compartment in Paul's desk. When she opened the box, she found a stack of letters and documents, evidence that Paul had been hiding something significant about his past, including files related to his previous marriages and financial dealings that suggested foul play. But before Grace could fully process what she had found, she heard Paul's voice behind her. "What are you doing, Grace?" he asked, his voice cold and menacing. Grace spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The look in Paul's eyes confirmed her worst fears. He knew exactly what she was discovering, and he wasn't going to let her walk away with that knowledge. Grace's world felt like it was closing in on her. She was alone, without anyone to turn to, and Paul's grip on her life was tightening by the day. The once safe and loving home had become a prison, and Grace was the prisoner, trapped in a nightmare that was growing darker with each passing moment. The discovery of the documents in Paul's study marked the beginning of Grace's desperate search for the truth. Though fear gripped her, she knew she couldn't ignore the growing suspicions about her stepfather. The evidence she found hinted at a darker past, one that Paul had gone to great lengths to conceal. With her mind racing and her heart heavy, Grace set out to uncover the secrets that had been hidden from her. The first step was to go through the letters she had found in the locked box. Among them were correspondences between Paul and a lawyer, discussing the abrupt end of his previous marriages. Each letter was more disturbing than the last, filled with legal jargon that boiled down to one unsettling conclusion. Paul had been involved in highly suspicious divorces, all of which left his former wives in financial ruin. One letter, dated June 14, 2018, detailed a large life insurance payout Paul received after the sudden death of his third wife, something he had never mentioned to Elaine or Grace. Driven by the need to know more, Grace decided to dig deeper into Paul's past. On May 12th, she managed to contact one of Paul's ex-wives, a woman named Linda, who lived in another state. Linda's voice trembled as she spoke to Grace over the phone. "I don't know what he's told you, but Paul isn't who he seems. He's dangerous," Linda warned, her voice filled with a mix of fear and regret. She explained that Paul had isolated her just as he was now doing to Grace, slowly taking control of every aspect of her life until she felt like a shadow of her former self. Linda's words confirmed what Grace feared, that Paul's manipulation wasn't new. It was a pattern he had followed before. Linda also hinted at Paul's involvement in her near-fatal accident, which had been ruled as a car crash caused by brake failure, but she suspected it was no accident. Grace's hands shook as she listened, realizing that Paul might have orchestrated not only her mother's death, but also those of his previous wives. Determined to find solid evidence, Grace began scrutinizing the details of her mother's death. She obtained a copy of the coroner's report, which initially ruled Elaine's death as a heart attack, a conclusion that had seemed plausible given Elaine's history of mild heart issues. But as Grace read through the report, she noticed a discrepancy. A trace amount of a drug called digoxin used to treat heart conditions was found in Elaine's system. The dosage was higher than what had been prescribed, but not enough to raise immediate suspicion. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the drug had been administered intentionally, perhaps to induce the heart attack that took her mother's life. She began researching digoxin and learned that an overdose could cause cardiac arrest, especially in someone with an existing heart condition. Grace's mind raced with the possibility that Paul had access to the drug and had used it to ensure Elaine's death appeared natural. Her next move was to confront Dr. Patel, the family physician who had prescribed Elaine's medication. On May 15th, Grace visited his office under the pretense of asking questions about her own health, but she quickly turned the conversation to her mother. "Dr. Patel, is it possible my mother was taking too much of her heart medication? The coroner's report mentioned a high level of digoxin," she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Patel looked surprised. "Elaine's dosage was carefully monitored. She was always diligent about following instructions," he replied, his brows furrowing in concern. Grace pressed on, asking if it was possible someone else could have tampered with the medication. Dr. Patel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I suppose, if someone had access to her medication, it's possible. But that's a serious accusation, Grace. Are you sure there's a reason to suspect foul play? Grace left the office with more questions than answers, but Dr. Patel's uncertainty fueled her determination. She knew she had to find the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As Grace's investigation deepened, her mental state continued to deteriorate. She struggled to separate reality from the visions of her mother, who appeared more frequently now, always urging her to keep searching, to uncover the truth before it was too late. Grace's nights were plagued with nightmares, and her days were filled with paranoia. She felt Paul's presence everywhere, watching, waiting for her to slip up. On May 20th, Grace stumbled upon an old email account of her mother's that had been forgotten in the chaos of her death. As she sifted through the messages, she found an email from Elaine to a close friend, dated just a week before her death. In the email, Elaine expressed concerns about Paul, mentioning that he had recently taken over her medication management. He says it's to help me remember, but it feels wrong. I've been feeling off, dizzy and weak, more than usual, Elaine wrote. The email was a chilling confirmation of Grace's worst fears. Paul had been slowly poisoning her mother, leading to her untimely death. With the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, Grace knew she was running out of time. Paul's true nature was darker than she had ever imagined, and she was the only one who knew the full extent of his deception. But as she prepared to confront him, she realized that Paul was already 2 steps ahead, and the danger was closer than ever. The night of May 25th, 2022, was eerily still. The clock had just struck midnight, and the house was bathed in shadows. Grace knew this was the moment she had to confront Paul. The evidence she had gathered over the past weeks weighed heavily on her, but it also fueled her determination. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She had to face him. The house was silent as Grace made her way to Paul's study, the very place where her suspicions had first taken root. The air was thick with tension, each creak of the floorboards echoing through the darkened hallway. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was unshakable. She gripped the folder containing all the documents and emails she had uncovered, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was to come. Paul was already in the study, sitting behind his desk as if he had been waiting for her. The lamp on the desk cast long, ominous shadows across the room, highlighting the coldness in his eyes. He looked up as Grace entered, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension thickening with each passing second. "I know what you did," Grace finally said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She tossed the folder onto the desk, the papers spilling out, letters, emails, the coroner's report. All the pieces of the puzzle laid bare before him. Paul glanced at the documents, his face remaining calm, almost indifferent. "What exactly do you think you know, Grace?" he asked, his tone low and measured as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than the life and death of her mother. "You killed her," Grace replied, her voice rising. "You were poisoning her, just like you did to your other wives. You wanted her out of the way, and now you're trying to make me look crazy so you can do the same to me." Paul leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Grace, you've been through a lot. I understand you're upset, but these accusations, they're absurd. You're not thinking clearly." Grace stepped forward, her fists clenched. "Stop pretending. I know everything. The insurance money, the drug overdose, the way you isolated her, just like you're doing to me. You've done this before, and I won't let you get away with it again." Paul's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said quietly, his voice chilling in its calmness. "But that's not going to change anything. You've been seeing things and hearing voices. Everyone knows you're unstable. Who do you think they'll believe? You, with your visions and wild accusations, or me, the grieving husband trying to help you through your issues?" Grace felt a wave of panic, but she pushed it down, refusing to let him see her fear. "You can't keep this hidden forever. I have proof. I've spoken to your ex-wife, Linda. She knows what you're capable of, and so do I." Paul stood up, slowly rounding the desk until he was just a few feet away from Grace. "Linda," he scoffed. "She was always a problem, but nothing I couldn't handle, just like I've handled everything else. But you, Grace, you're making this harder than it needs to be." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Grace took a step back, her heart pounding. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her as she realized just how dangerous Paul truly was. But she also knew that this was her only chance to stop him. In a desperate move, Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, which she had set to record the entire conversation. "It's over, Paul. I've got everything I need. The police will be here any minute." For a split second, Paul's eyes flashed with something like fear, but it was quickly replaced by cold determination. In a swift motion, he lunged forward, trying to grab the phone from her hand. Grace dodged, but he caught her arm, twisting it painfully as he tried to wrestle the phone away. "Give it to me, Grace!" Paul hissed, his calm facade finally cracking. "You're not going to ruin everything I've worked for!" Grace struggled, but she refused to let go. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor, but she managed to break free, stumbling backward toward the door. She knew she couldn't overpower him, but she didn't need to. She just needed to get out. Paul picked up the phone, but before he could check the recording, they both heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Grace had sent her location to Emily just before confronting Paul, a precaution she had taken in case things went wrong. The realization hit Paul at the same time it did Grace. The police were almost there. Paul's face twisted with rage, but he knew he was out of time. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You'll pay for this one way or another." But Grace wasn't listening. She bolted out of the room, her heart racing as she ran down the hallway toward the front door. The sirens grew louder, closer, and for the first time in weeks, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Help was on the way. As she burst through the front door and into the night, Grace knew that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. But the scars left by Paul's manipulation would remain, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. And as the police arrived, lights flashing, Grace allowed herself to breathe, knowing that she had survived. The morning after the confrontation, the quiet streets of Pine Valley were abuzz with the news of Paul's arrest. The police had arrived just in time to prevent what could have been another tragedy, and Grace was finally safe. But the emotional toll of the events left her shaken, her mind reeling from the realization of how close she had come to losing everything. Grace spent the next few days in a state of exhaustion, barely able to sleep, haunted by the memories of that night and the weeks leading up to it. The community, once skeptical of Grace's increasingly erratic behavior, rallied around her as the truth about Paul's actions came to light. The evidence Grace had gathered, combined with the testimony of Paul's ex-wife Linda, painted a damning picture of a man who had manipulated and harmed those closest to him for years. The contents of the locked box, the high level of digoxin in Elaine's system, and Paul's attempts to control Grace's life were enough to secure his arrest. Paul was charged with multiple crimes, including the attempted murder of Grace, the murder of Elaine, and insurance fraud. The trial, which took place in late June, was a media sensation. In the courtroom, Grace sat quietly, her face pale but resolute, as the prosecution laid out the case against Paul. The evidence was overwhelming, and Paul's cold, emotionless demeanor did little to win sympathy from the jury. As the trial drew to a close, the jury found Paul guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Grace, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it did little to ease the pain of losing her mother and the trauma she had endured. In the months that followed, Grace began the slow process of healing. She moved out of the house that had been the scene of so much pain and started therapy to help her rebuild her life. Though the scars of her ordeal would never fully fade, Grace was determined to find peace, knowing that the man who had caused so much suffering would never harm anyone again. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey through Grace's story, a powerful reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk behind closed doors. As we reflect on the devastating impact of psychological manipulation, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the signs were there all along? Or did Paul's deception run too deep? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? Share your stories in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that reveal the darker side of human nature. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We appreciate your support and look forward to continuing these important conversations with you.